Good evening. Hope you're glad to be here tonight. I know I am. It's always good to be back home. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be asked to speak on this subject. Just recently, this weekend, I was at a retreat in Dahlgren, Illinois, where I brought my kids from my church, and I brought Noah Tyndall, and I brought Rod. And just a quick word on Noah. If you all know him, I don't know why I'm acting like y'all don't, but he is fantastic. And I love Noah, and he's younger than me, but I look up to him. He's fantastic. Also, I brought Rod, who is the youth minister here, and all throughout the weekend when decisions had to be made, whether what time we're waking up, what time we're leaving, what restaurant we're going to, I'd look to Rod, even though it was my event. And I remember I asked him, I was like, well, what do we do? And he said, well, you're in charge here. And I didn't like that. If I'm ever with Rod, he's in charge. And I just was going to go ahead and tell you, you have a fantastic youth minister here. He does a great job with everything he does. I have to do it every time, talk about him. I was asked to talk about Romans 8. I was asked to talk about suffering, which sometimes isn't easy to talk about. If you've ever watched a sculptor when they work, they start with usually a rough, unshaped block of stone, hard, cold, and seemingly unremarkable. And the sculptor will take a tool and he'll chip at it piece by piece, striking the stone with force. And in those beginning phases of when he's striking the stone, he's usually striking it pretty violently. And to an outsider, it may just look like a process of destruction. Every hammer swing sends fragments flying. And you wonder how anything good could come from such a violent process. But beneath the surface of the stone, the sculptor sees something we don't. He sees a masterpiece, and he sees the masterpiece, and it's just wanting to be revealed. It's wanting to be seen. And like where I'm going with this, in life, we experience that pain. We experience loss, disappointment, blows that feel absolutely senseless, like parts of us are just constantly being chipped away. But in those moments, what seems like destruction is actually part of a beautiful plan from God that shapes us into something glorious. And tonight, as we look at Romans 8, we'll see how God can use suffering not to break us, but I would say to break into us and to transform us. Through every hardship, he is shaping us up for glory. We are in a time right now in our world, in our society, where it just seems like there's not much light at the end of the tunnel. If you look around, there is just so much division, especially with politics and the election year coming just next month. And it seems like everyone's at each other's throats. You look around, we see that we just had hurricanes with record winds, leaving thousands of people's homes affected. We have wars going on all around our world. We have a mental health crisis that infects the teenagers, the children. We have a lot of suffering in this world. And I was reading online, and someone asked artificial intelligence. They asked AI the following prompt. This is what they asked it. They said, if you were Satan, how would you make people distance themselves from the truth, being God? And this is what AI wrote back. If I were to think like Satan from a hypothetical standpoint, my primary goal would be to create as much separation as possible between people and God, capitalizing on human weaknesses and the fallen nature of the world. Here are the steps I would take. And I'm just going to read you two. It had many, but I'm going to read you two. This one I thought was interesting. Number one, create divisions. Foment division within families, churches, and communities over doctrinal issues, politics, or social matters. Division leads to bitterness and strife, which weakens faith and unity in Christ. And then this point that I think really relates tonight, this is what he said, what AI said. I would sow doubt about God's character. I would encourage people to question God's goodness, love, and justice, especially in times of suffering or tragedy. If I can convince people that God doesn't care or that God isn't real, they are more likely to abandon faith. And when you look at the idea, when you look at the debate of suffering, everyone uses this question to try to discredit and to disprove God. They say this: how could a good God allow suffering? You've heard it many times. They use it all the time. How could a good God allow suffering? So let's just start there tonight. Let's just answer that just as good as we can. How could a good God allow suffering? To start, I think it is safe to say that most of the suffering in our world is directly or of choices that go against God. Whenever a person is victimized by a crime, whether that's emotionally, spiritually, physically abused, abandoned, left parentless, whenever those things happen, somebody is going against God. Someone's going against God. And that just also makes me think about the Southern Christian Home, how wonderful of a thing we have going on there. How wonderful those people are helping those kids every single day. And I love the Southern Christian Home. But continuing on, I think this is why Jesus taught us to pray that God's kingdom would come and his will would be done on earth, because his kingdom and his will are often resisted. People are always going against God. And Jesus Christ knows firsthand despair. He knows what rejection feels like. He knows what loneliness feels like. He knows what grief feels like. He knows what torture feels like. He knows what pain feels like. And you want to know the thing about it is he did not numb himself to it. He did not smile and say, everything happens for a reason. No, he experienced it. He bore it and he lived it. And you say, okay, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, while Jesus' suffering does not answer the question, how could a good God allow suffering? What it does is it tells us what the answer can't be. And the answer can't be that Jesus doesn't love us. Pastor and author Tim Keller writes it very well. He says this: it cannot be that God is indifferent or detached from our condition. God takes our misery and suffering so seriously that he was willing to take it on himself. And tonight, as we look at, just briefly, as we look at suffering and how that leads us to glory, I want one thing to be so abundantly clear. And if you get nothing from this lesson, that's okay. Please get this. You are absolutely not alone in your suffering. You are not alone. And if you don't believe me, look around. But if you don't believe that, look at the Bible. Look at someone like Job, who lost everything. Look at someone like David, who was constantly tormented by King Saul. Look at someone like Hannah, someone who just longed to have a child and didn't receive that for so long. Look at someone like Naomi, who lost her husband and both of her sons. That's suffering. Look at someone like Jonah, prayed that his life would be taken away. That's suffering. So I just want it to be clear, just right off the chute here, that you are not alone. And I'd put it this way: if the Bible is not quiet about these stories, neither do you have to be quiet about yours. So let's start with Romans 8, just first verse, 18. Romans 8:18. This is what it says: I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Well, right from the start, what is that verse telling us? What is it saying? What does it mean? Well, I think it's meaning that the suffering on earth is bad. It's really bad. And our lives are full of hardship, heartbreak, death, pain, tragedy, sickness, you name it. It's full of those things and it's bad. And Paul is saying the burdens are bad, but the blessings to come far outweigh it. So much so that we can't even compare the two. And let me tell you what a blessing it is to know that one day the suffering will stop, that one day the pain will go away, that one day the tears will dry, they will stop, and we will finally be with Jesus. But in the meantime, what do we do? What do we do with our suffering? How do we take something that's so bad like suffering and lead it to glory, which is good? There's a quote that I share constantly with my teenagers in my Bible class, and it's a quote, and this is what it is. Christians are like nails. The harder you hit them, the deeper they go. Now I'd put it this way. I think that we find glory not in the pain of the strike, but the depth of its effect. Now, while that quote does not answer the question of suffering, the question of pain, I found that there's a solidarity suffering can produce within us that draws compassion out of us like nothing else can. Right? I look in this room at people I know. Some of the most compassionate people in this room probably have been through things you don't even know. Some of the most compassionate people in here have been through so much suffering. And anyone who's experienced infertility, anxiety, chemo, or loss knows that it can create a tenderness for anyone who's going through the same thing. And you know, when I wrote this down, I have it right here. It says, look at the ladies of this church. Think about the ladies at downtown. I've watched it countless times when someone is suffering and they've been through it, and whether they've been through it or not, you know what they do? They go to them, they visit them, they make meals for them, and someone that I think does it so well is my grandma. But you know what? Right now, my grandma is going through the suffering, and you know what I've seen? I've seen everyone at this church ask me how she is. I've seen people in my church that don't even know her say, how's Donna Kay? Because they know what it's like, and they don't want her to be alone. And they go through it with her. So suffering can either break us or it can break us open. And I would say the most painful part of your story might just be the most life-giving part of someone else's. I'd put it this way. The most painful part of your story might be the most glory-giving part of someone else's life. We do not love other people in the midst of pain by pretending that it isn't all that bad or by trying to quickly fix it. If someone was suffering in this room, we don't go up to that person and say, it's okay, quit crying, I went through it, I survived. We don't do that. We live it out, and we help those people by doing exactly what the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Rome, and that was this: rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Why? Because platitudes cannot hold a candle to presence. You want to know the absolute best thing about suffering that the entire world misses? It is this: when we suffer as a church family. You want to know the greatest thing about rejoicing that the whole world misses? Is when we rejoice with our church family. And I got emotional writing this down, but that is what downtown does so well. The other day I went to my grandma's rehab where she's at right now doing her therapy. And when you go in, you have to sign a sheet. Everyone signs this sheet. It's not exclusive for my grandma. Everyone signs this sheet. And I went to that sheet to sign my name, and all I saw was you guys. That's all I saw. I saw one or two other people for someone else. But you know what? Donna Kay had a ton of visitors, and it was because of the church. That's what it's about. I've seen the most incredible highs at this church at the time I've been here. I've also seen the incredible lows when someone dies, when someone passes away, and we suffer together. I've been at the highs, I've been at the lows. That's what it's about. It's the church family. And while I often still have questions about suffering, I have faith that our grief is actually holy to God. That our grief can be as much worship as anything we do. And you say, are you sure about that? Have you ever cried to God? And you're crying to him. You don't have the words, but you have the tears. But some reason when that happens, when you cry to God, but you don't have the words for it, sometimes, and I don't know if you feel this way, it feels like worship. Because it feels like to me that there's no one I would rather go to in this moment than him. And therefore, yeah, I may not have the words, but I know he understands my heart. I have faith that Jesus, when he stood at the tomb for his friend and cried, those tears were as bitter as our own. And that pain and suffering has absolutely no eternal sting whatsoever. Suffering can break us, or it can break into us. And it can break our hearts and reveal a glory, a compassion, a love that is so deep that it can help someone else that's going through the same thing. Romans 8:26, and I'm just going to read just 4 verses. In the same way the Spirit helps us in our weakness, we do not know what we ought to pray, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. And those he called, he also justified. And those he justified, he also glorified. God can take the most horrible thing, the most dark, painful thing, and he can turn it into something that is so beautiful, that is so life-giving, that is so life-changing, that is so glorious, that is the most needed thing you could ever need, and turn it into something amazing. I'd put it this way: the very worst sin that's ever been committed was the murder of the Son of God. But the very best thing that's ever happened on this planet was the death of the Son of Jesus, or the death of God, Jesus Christ, and that he rose from the dead. And if God can make the very worst thing the very best thing, then I know he can take our disappointment, our sin, our foolishness, and work things together for good. God is not always protection from the storm, but God is certainly protection in the storm. I'll end with this story. It's a powerful story, and I'm just going to read it to you. A powerful story of a woman named Corrie Boom and her family during World War II. Corrie, a Dutch Christian, and her family helped hide Jews from the Nazis in their home. And eventually they were caught, and Corrie, along with her sister Betsy, were sent to a concentration camp. And life in the camp was brutal. Constant fear, hunger, and death surrounded them. However, in the midst of this horrific storm, Corrie and her sister held tightly to their faith in God. Despite their suffering, they found ways to encourage other prisoners with Bible studies and prayers. They even smuggled a Bible into the camp to share the hope of Christ. Tragically, Betsy died in the camp. But before her death, she told her sister Corrie that there was no pit so deep that God's love wasn't deeper. Corrie survived the war and later shared her story around the world, speaking about forgiveness and the power of faith through hardship. Though God did not stop the storm, though God did not stop the Holocaust or prevent the Booms from being imprisoned, he protected Corrie and Betsy spiritually, and their faith remained a source of life to all. But what I love most about that story is that before Betsy died, she said what I just read, and she said this: there is no pit so deep that God's love isn't deeper. And I think that is exactly what Paul is saying when he says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. The suffering is deep, but God's love is deeper. Tonight, I'm going to end with this verse from Romans 8. It's a few verses up, verses 38 and 39. This is what it says. I want to end with this. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anyone else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. No matter what the storms are, no matter how fierce the winds blow, no matter how deep the waters rise, there is absolutely nothing that can separate us from the love and protection of Jesus Christ. His love doesn't always shield us from the pain, but it sustains us through the darkest nights. And our God is not distant from our suffering, but he is in it with us. He is offering hope, strength, and peace that surpasses all understanding. And at the end, through every tear and every trial, we find that his love is always deeper and that his love never lets go. May we as a church walk in truth, knowing that Jesus is not just the God who calms the seas, but the God who stands with us in the storm. Tonight, if you have any need, if you need prayers of the church, if you're suffering and you feel alone, you're not. We have elders, we have deacons, we have members of this church who are here for you. If you have any need, please come as we stand and as we